Welcome to the next instalment of the Awareness Weeks with Edinburgh City Libraries. We are continuing with our raising awareness for diversity and inclusion in the public arena, and we are honoured to have an in-conversation with two renowned professionals, Nick Coleman and Professor Raymond MacDonald. It is now my pleasure to pass over to Nick and Raymond, who will discuss their take on the coming together of music and deafness.
Thanks very much. And yeah, it's great to have the opportunity to chat with Nick today. I mean, just to begin with, as an observation, when I first read Nick's book, the Train in the Night, which I found absolutely beautiful book and resonated with me in so many levels. But when I first read the book, there was a quote from Paul Simon that came to me right away. Everybody loves the sound of a train in the distance. Everybody thinks it's true. And for me, as a 16-year-old, when I heard Paul Simon sing that song, the metaphor of the train was so vivid and so strong. And indeed, it's a metaphor that stayed with me all my life. It became the title for my first CD, which actually the artwork is just over the wall there. It says "A Train in the Distance" by the Humdrum Quartet.
Fantastic.
And yeah, and reacquainting myself with your book yesterday, I was looking through it, and I'd forgotten the power of the final sentence. Wouldn't it be great if in between the notes I heard the faint passing sigh of the train to Peterborough making its way in the distance? And so the metaphor of the train in the book is really powerful. And the book itself is an incredible, vivid evocation of the power of music in people's life, the importance that music has in our life, the way we use music not only for pleasure, but the way in which we use music to shape our identity and mold our identity, and also what happens to our relationship with music when we're faced with illness and when we're faced with change. And one of the beautiful things about the book is that the book isn't just about music therapy or the power that music can have for good. It's about our personal journey with music, and in fact our struggles to maintain a relationship with music as we move through a process of change. But for me, one of the strong and beautiful metaphors in the book is this idea of a train, and the way in which the train is literally present, but also metaphorically present. So I guess my first opening question here is, could you tell us a little bit about why the train was so important in this book? But I'm thinking about that in terms of your relationship with music and the sense of loss and the renegotiation of identity.
Wow. Well, thank you for such a beautiful introduction, Raymond. I couldn't have asked for a better summary of what the book is attempting to be about. The train. Well, it's a long time ago since I wrote it, and I've always fervently believed that you shouldn't over-explain metaphor. However, as I lay in my bed as a small boy, you could hear the train to Peterborough passing about half a mile away beyond the chestnut trees in the village where I grew up, just outside Cambridge and on the edge of the fens. And it seemed to carry with it something of vital importance to me about experience and potential, and dare one even say it, the poetic dimension of life. And I had no idea as I lay there in my bed at the age of 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, that this was going on inside of me. But I became aware when I lost my hearing many years later, how important that experience had been, and that the train was somehow indicative of openings that may exist in life, just beyond the trees, just out of sight, just beyond your cognitive reach. All you need to know is that it's a train and that it's passing across the landscape, and that theoretically at least you can join it, and that it might be carrying freight. It's the idea that you don't have to have everything in life in front of you within your grasp, that life is infinitely full of potential. And trains, as you know as well as I, and many of our listeners will know, trains are in music from the start. I mean, you don't have to start quoting Hank Williams or anybody like that to know how important trains are in music. And I'm so glad you quoted that Paul Simon lyric. Whilst talking, I've been trying to remember which song it is. I know it, but
it's A Train in the Distance. It's from his album Heart and Bones.
Yeah. Okay, so that's what the train is to me.
Excellent. And I'm thinking that in the book, one of the key themes is the way in which music prior to your hearing loss was such a fundamental part of your life, and the way in which, you know, these pivotal moments in your life, music has an important role. And I wonder, maybe if you could just talk very generally about the importance that music had in your life prior to your hearing loss.
Oh my God, that's a really tough one. I mean, I was brought up in a musical household where music was everywhere and an intrinsic part of life. And I've used the phrase elsewhere, I think, that it constitutes an important part of my family's internal social breathing. In other words, there wasn't a huge amount of very lucid communication about our inner worlds going on in my family, but there was a lot of music instead. And my dad was a very keen amateur musician. He ran music groups and wrote music and played very badly on a variety of awful old knackered instruments, most of them medieval. That was his great passion. So I grew up with the idea that music was enormously important. It was modelled for me from the year scratch. And we was kind of churchy, and I sang in the church choir. And like most choir boys, I was both deeply embarrassed by this on the football field, but also I secretly quite enjoyed it as well, the ritual and the spookiness of it all, and the music. And then at about the age of 12, with the onset of the hormonal explosion we all know as puberty, I collided with Rod Stewart singing Maggie May, and other things of that ilk. Some people quote David Bowie's Starman, other people quote Roxy Music, Virginia Plain, which was also a big one for me. But for me, it was Maggie May. Something flipped over in my consciousness, and I became utterly obsessed with the possibilities that pop music offered. And that was partly to do with the fact that, of course, my mum and dad had no interest in popular music at all. It had to be Bach or Gabrielli, or it's no good at all. And so Rod Stewart and your fellow countryman Nazareth were an early jumping off point for me. Anything loud with guitars and men in tight trousers mincing around. And I'd always had some kind of slightly weird relationship with the Rolling Stones, which we don't need to go into here, that really exploded into life. And we're talking about 71, 72. And from then on, listening to music became a way of thinking and being and feeling life that simply didn't arrive by any other means. I was never a tremendously good musician. I did it a bit because I was required to, because of the family I came from. But my two sisters were much better musicians than I was, but I had great ears, and I was very proud of that. And I started engaging in the process of discernment at quite an early age. I fancied myself as the greatest rock critic in the world from the age of 15, as a lot of people do. And as you say, the procedure of life was then marked and annotated and graced by music at every single turn. It was the way in which I interacted with myself, I suppose, is the brief answer.
Yeah. I think that's
Can I interrupt and ask, is it the same for you?
No, I think in so many ways it's exactly the same. You're talking about those pivotal moments. For me, it was Elvis Costello and the Beatles as well. Once I heard Elvis Costello and the Beatles, life was never the same. I was quite sporty as a young teenager, and then all of a sudden, when I discovered music, that was all I wanted to do, and it became something that kind of consumed me. But I think as you're talking here, I think there's a really important sort of broader point about this notion of universal musicality, and I think that we are all musical. Yes. In so many different ways. It doesn't mean that we're all destined to become Beyonce or Mozart or Charlie Parker, but music is a fundamental part of everybody's lives, and we can respond emotionally to music. We mark the important bits of our life via the music that's playing and our musical taste. And I think that's, as you're talking there, I'm just thinking of how important music is for everybody. And I think your book in particular really highlights that point. And not only that, but I think when you're talking about not just your listening in music, but your engagement with music as well, and the way in which you perform music as a singer. And I think that's also another important issue, that we all have the capacity to express ourselves through music as well as being able to respond emotionally to music.
So would you argue that there's no such thing as tone deafness?
The short answer is yes. I would argue that there's no such thing as tone deafness. That there is a condition what's called dysmelodia, and that probably is the closest to what we think of tone deafness. But so many people, when I say, we are all musical, they will use this phrase, "Oh, not me, my family aren't musical, I don't have a musical gene, I'm tone deaf." But in reality, virtually nobody's tone deaf. The ability to differentiate between pitches is something that we all need to do in order to have a conversation. As we're taking turns in conversation here, we're not just listening to the meaning of the words, we're actually processing the melodic contour of a sentence. And that ability to differentiate in pitch and understand the melodic contour of a sentence is something that we can all do. And in many ways, people often think they're tone deaf because of a negative experience of music when they were young. I often hear the same sort of story that people say to me, "Oh, I'm tone deaf, my family aren't musical. I remember when I was at school and I wanted to, join the choir, and or I wanted to learn to play the guitar, and there was only one or two guitars in the school, and I got a test." Very often, and looking back, maybe 10, 20 years, people get a test to see who's musical and who can get access to the specialist music lessons. But the important point here is that people remember these negative experiences, and they say, "Oh, I had a bad experience in the choir, or I couldn't do that test," and so they believe that actually they're not musical, and that flies in the face of all the research, and flies in the face of so many examples across the world where cultures everybody in the culture engages in music. So universal musicality is not just a utopian ideal. I think we all have the capacity to engage and play and express ourselves through music.
So how do you account for talent then? I mean, the difference between Miles Davis and somebody playing a bugle in the local brass band.
Yeah.
How do you explain that in those terms?
So I think, if we're all musical, but I'm not necessarily saying that we're all musical to the same extent, and I think that's really important as well. That we can all be musical, we all have the potential to express ourselves musically, but that's not saying that we're all going to be the same. So, So for example, if musical ability does have a genetic component, and it's possible and sounds reasonable that certain aspects of musical ability do have a genetic component. My argument here would be that genetic component is, if it's normally distributed, as many genetic components are, I think of a normal distribution. So, some people have more natural ability than other people. But that normal distribution is around a mean that is much higher than what we think. I think the popular belief is that if musical ability has a genetic component, it's around it, and people at the tail end have no musical ability. Okay. My argument is that if there is a normal distribution, then that mean is much higher than what we think, and so people at the lower end still have the capacity to learn. I mean, another way to think about it is that learning to play the guitar, learning to play the piano, is in some respects motor coordination. It's about learning to where to put your fingers on the fretboard or where to put your fingers on the keys. In the same way that learning to drive a car is motor coordination. But we don't tend to think of driving as a skill that you either have or don't have. I'm not from a family of drivers, or our family don't have the driving. It sounds ridiculous, but being a musician has a culture in Western society. It has a cultural, a social cachet, that people that are musicians are part of a cultural elite. And in order to have that cultural elite, we need a kind of cultural underbelly. And I think very often people feel that they don't have the skill for that.
I hear exactly what you're saying. And the reason I brought up Miles Davis too was because there is something about technical facility, isn't there, that is rewarded, traditionally more highly regarded. Yeah. And if you compare Miles Davis to, say, a great technical trumpet player like Freddie Hubbard, you'd think, Freddie Hubbard is a far superior trumpet player. Is he? Heck. Miles Davis has a huge amount more to say than Freddie Hubbard, and we all know that, those of us who care about modern jazz trumpet players. And we know we're having a very particular experience when we're listening to either one of those guys. But one thing for sure is, even if Freddie Hubbard can hit more high notes faster and with greater frequency and greater accuracy, greater meaning is going to be emerging from the Miles Davis record that you're listening to. I would argue that. You might feel differently.
No, I think that's a great point. And I think it also points to this notion of what is musical virtuosity and what is virtuosity. And I think in some respects, we define musical virtuosity along very narrow parameters. So people that can play fast, people that can play accurately, people that have great technical facility. But actually, I think if we have a broader definition of what virtuosity is, so that musical virtuosity involves a creative virtuosity, a listening virtuosity, a social virtuosity, because at its heart, music is social. And one of the reasons that we love music is because we want to communicate through music and be with other people. So, there's a special type of virtuosity that people like Miles Davis has. So he is virtuoso, but I think we need broader definitions of what virtuosity is.
We are so singing from the same hymn sheet here.
Now, can I be what's the word? Because I'm having such a great time, but I'm aware that I think that there's a theme that I think it'd be really nice to explore, and that's important to explore, and that's the relationship between music and hearing loss. And so at the start of our talk, you discussed how important music was in your life and how fundamental it was in your life. And I think anybody watching and listening will recognise and understand and sort of feel the same way. But something quite profound happens at a particular point in your life, and I wonder if you could just give us a little bit of insight into what happened and how your experience of music changed.
I can certainly tell you what happened. Very simply, I woke up one morning, had no hearing in one ear at all, and in the other ear everything was distorted and chaotic, and I couldn't sit up and I couldn't really move, and every time I did move I threw up, and it transpired after a rather too long messing around in hospitals that I had suffered sudden neurosensory or sensory neural hearing loss, which is very, very difficult to explain because it's very hard to look at organs that are buried deeply in the head. You can't saw someone's face off to have a look to see what's happened. And it was never finally given a definitive explanation, but it was either an autoimmune response or a vascular response, or possibly what was thought for the first 10 years since it happened, and it happened in 2007. It was a migraine problem. But yes, I lost my hearing overnight for no apparent reason. It was initially called a stroke of the inner ear. They're not common, but they're not rare either. It does happen. And my life was absolutely radically changed overnight. I had suffered from appalling depression once I discovered that the hearing wasn't going to come back. And chief amongst my despairs was the thought that I would never be able to hear music again, even though I had one ear that was still functional and was still registering on hearing tests as functional. But one of the interesting things that I discovered very early on in the process, seeing my consultant, was that we don't hear with our ears with that equipment, we hear with our brains. And the 3 years it took to get back to some kind of what I would call rational hearing, and the one remaining was a process of exploiting the plasticity of the brain and relearning to hear music through one portal rather than two. One of the interesting phenomena that accompanies hearing loss in one ear is that you have no directionality in hearing at all. So wherever I am, I can't hear where the sound's coming from. So I spend a lot of time going, what's going on? And I have to be very careful. I stand with my back to a wall in more than one sound source, simply because it feels stabler. And music. It was disarranged completely for a good 3 years. Very badly distorted. Sometimes there were strange, what I can only presume were cortical difficulties resulted in music dissembles from my brain through the one remaining ear. I remember going to there was a remastering, I don't know what you call it when it's filmed, a remastering of the Led Zeppelin film, and The Song Remains the Same, which is a terrible film, but I'm very fond of it because it's part of my adolescence. And I went along stupidly long before I was fully equipped to do so, and it was a preview in a London preview theatre. It was unbelievably loud, painfully so I only lasted 10 minutes. But what was most shocking about the experience was that the music came in a kind of kit form. It reached my brain in kit form. So I could hear that there were drums. I could hear that there was a voice. I could hear that there was what was clearly a guitar, even though it didn't sound like a guitar. It sounded like a tube train coming very fast into a station. And it wasn't even reaching my brain in the correct order. So the rhythm was completely chaotic. It sounded like something avant-garde by Milford Graves in 1969 from a New York loft. Led Zeppelin, sounding like Milford Graves. Some people might think that's a beautiful thing. It was bloody painful, I can tell you. And I that was a salutary moment for me. And I left that theatre realizing that there was a lot more work to be done, but also, as it were, ringing in my ears the notion that music is not something that just goes in whole and then you receive it whole and that's the end of the story. It's a process that involves the deep complicity of your brain in making sense of it, which is something, of course, in your profession you know more about than I do.
Yeah, but I think that's fascinating in the sense that this wasn't a passive process, that actually the recognition that, you know, what you were hearing, you were actively engaged in processing, and the way in which you thought about it and the way in which you interacted changed how you heard the music. So in some respects, was there a relearning of how to listen?
Yes. That's a really difficult question to answer, Raymond, because I remember the moment when I first heard something unselfconsciously that made sense. And I talk about it in the book. It was Amy Winehouse. My daughter was listening to Amy Winehouse in a different room, and I found myself following the tune and not being upset by it. Yeah. And it was an absolutely huge epiphanic moment for me. I thought, oh my God, there is hope. And I spoke to a prominent neuroscientist purely by good fortune, who had told me that the only way you're going to get some sense back into your listening is by reconfiguring the pathways in your brain. And what you've got to do, he suggested, is lie in bed before you go to sleep every night, think through your favorite piece of music, because if you're thinking it, it will be as it should be. And he pointed out that if EEG machines, ECG, whatever it is,
yeah,
what are they called?
EEGs.
EEG. An EEG scan of your brain when you're listening to music will register pretty much the same pattern as when you're thinking about music. And he took this as an indicator that if I were able to think hard about music, almost as a kind of ritual practice, then it would enable my brain to reconfigure its pathways. And so I did. I sorted out a piece of music from the music that I know and love. It was a track called Equinox by John Coltrane, which is simple and has got lots of space in it. And I know it virtually off by heart from start to finish. And every night for, I would say, at least 6 months, probably more than that, I would, as almost like saying one's prayers, I would lie in bed and think through in the correct order, in proper time, Coltrane's Equinox, so that my brain would learn how to make sense of input from outside my brain as well as input from inside my brain. I don't know whether it worked, but within 3 years, I was hearing melody as melody, harmony as harmony, rhythm as rhythm, and it all cohered and held together. There were remnants of distortion. And to this day, I can't listen to music very loud. I couldn't possibly go to a gig with drums in it. But I have my established practice for listening to music. It's all in mono through my one ear. And I have a chair that I sit on that's at just the right angle. My brain has allowed the tinnitus to be switched off for the duration until my brain gets tired, and then it roars back in. So yeah, it's been a gradual process that's involved some rational input from me, but also just allowing it to happen.
Yeah, but I think that idea of active engagement and active listening, I think a lot of the textbooks differentiate between different types of musical engagement, and we talk about active music making and passive music listening. But I think your example here shows us that listening to music is not passive in any sense of the word at all. That we're actively engaged on so many different levels as we hear music.
I think that's absolutely true. However, there is an interesting wrinkle to this, which is that I find that listening to music came back to me more readily if I did it whilst I was doing something else, which chimed with a friend of mine who's a specialist in people with autism. And there's a special mode of teaching in autism which involves distraction. I don't know whether this chimes with you at all, but I find that if I'm driving, I hear music in a different way, and in some ways a more absorbent way than if I'm sitting in front of it and focusing. It doesn't mean that I'm focusing, I'm getting the music any better when I sit in front of it, but I'm more self-conscious of the process of listening when I'm sitting in front of it, as opposed to when I'm, say, driving or cooking or walking, something else, so that the process of listening isn't my focus. Mm. In some ways, that allows the music to become more penetrative, and that it continues to be my practice to this day. I very, very seldom sit down in front of music to focus on it, because it makes me aware of the limitations of my hearing and the tinnitus and all of that. But I always listen to music ferociously, whether I'm doing something else or not. So I'm probably lethal on the roads. Actually, no, I'm not. I'm very safe. But I totally understand what you mean about the difference between passive and active listening. And the truth is, I've always been an active listener because I was brought up to be. Music has never been trivial for me. It's always been massively serious for reasons I touched on at the beginning.
Yeah, and I think that's another great example as well of music always being about more than just the music.
Yes.
In the sense, and I think your book beautifully highlights that. That there's, our first relationship, family holidays, important sporting events in our life. That the music that was playing at those moments becomes seared into our consciousness for the rest of our life. And I think that's one of the special, unique, and beautiful qualities that music has.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree with you more, and I have nothing to add to that.
Yeah. So actually, there's a couple of I was thinking of other. Thinking about the relationship between music and hearing loss, and another common theme when you look at the literature around this is that, and it's sometimes summarised by what's called the sensory compensation hypothesis. That if you lose ability in one sense, then other senses can help. The plasticity in your brain can also allow the other senses to help you experience the loss. So one of the common themes in music and hearing loss is that the vibrations of music, people with hearing loss can experience music more through vibrations, are more sensitive to vibrations. Is that something that you've experienced yourself?
I've always subscribed to Lee Scratch Perry's view that we hear with our whole bodies.
Yeah.
He has it the other way around to me. I always think of the bass aspect being down here, belly and chest, and he always insists the bass is in the head. But then he's Lee Scratch Perry and he rules. But yeah, I mean, I think those of us who are privileged to go to loud reggae gigs or equivalent, it can be anything, will testify that it's a full body experience. It's not just something that you hear dulcetly through your ear holes. It's a totally all-encompassing, totally involving experience. And I was interested to see the new film, The Sound of Metal. Which touches on this. It's about a heavy metal drummer who experiences something not dissimilar to my experience, except he lost both ears to a very, very high degree. I think there was some residual hearing left, but nothing worth using. And you find yourself asking the question throughout the film, yeah, but you're a drummer, you can feel it. Yeah. You don't worry about harmony and tone and things like that. You just hit them, don't you? And that is a musical experience enough. And of course, the film resolves in a rather beautiful but different way to that. But yes, I'm certain that we do experience music with our other senses as well.
Mm-hmm. Because I think that the example of Evelyn Glennie, the Scottish percussionist, once again, a virtuoso by any definition of a virtuoso, who's profoundly deaf, but she performs on her bare feet, and she feels these rhythms through her body. She feels the vibrations. She can differentiate tones through the way in which her body vibrates.
Oh, she can differentiate tones.
Yes.
Oh, God. I never knew that. I just assumed that she got the rhythm.
The rhythm, yes. So I've seen her talk about, right. I don't know to what extent it's very fine grained, but she can, so the bass tones feel differently from the higher tones.
Oh wow, okay, yeah. Well, I've no doubt that when I was struggling to get my music back, put it that way, I've no doubt that I expanded my range of feelers, as it were, and I do recall pressing myself up against speakers and stuff like that just to feel more, in a very stupid and dangerous way. My hearing was so delicate at that stage. Yeah, no, I mean, music is, I think we're reaching the point where we're saying that music is all-encompassing, intellectually, spiritually, emotionally, and physiologically. Yeah. It involves everything.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons why music is, this universal presence in our life and society today, but also historically as well, that music has this place within society that's also very multifaceted as well. It's not just a pleasurable art form, but it forms part of the most important rituals of life. It has an important medical role as well, and I think as your books demonstrate as well, it's a fundamental part of our identity.
Certainly is, yeah.
And thinking again about music and hearing loss as well, because another theme that came across in your book for me was that that the realization that actually it was quite painful to listen to music for a while, and that actually was anxiety provoking. So music, it was a struggle to re-establish your relationship with music, because at certain times music was actually making you a little bit depressed and anxious.
Oh, completely. I mean, there's the scene in The Sound of Metal that made me cry. The film we were just talking about, and it made me really cry, was when he takes his recording equipment in his Airstream mobile home and destroys it. He realizes he's never going to be able to use it again. Music has lost all its meaning to him as far as he's concerned, and he yanks his recording equipment off the wall and destroy. And I was in floods, and the reason I was in floods was because it reminded me vividly of a moment that I'd actually forgotten, and it's making me feel slightly teary just to think about it now. I went into the kitchen pretty soon after I was back on my feet, but aware that my hearing was stuffed for the foreseeable, if not forever. And I got the claw hammer out my toolbox and I brought it in here to over there where my very posh, expensive stereo system was. And I stood over my stereo system with the hammer and thought about it. And I stopped myself and I won't bore you with the rationality that the rationalization that I went through, but I did stop myself, I'm very glad to say. But I wanted to destroy it. I really wanted to destroy it. And interestingly, I couldn't listen to it for 13 years. I only started listening to my expensive stereo system last year, partly because the sound was so good on it, and I couldn't cope with the hugeness of the frequency range. But it was so distressing. What had become a central part of my life, sitting and listening to music very, very intensively, and no longer being able to do it in the same way. That thing just stood as a reminder of how far I'd fallen. But it's okay. I can listen to it again. It's okay.
Because there was I think that the journey is a really important sort of aspect of the book as well. That things were changing all the time for you, and in very, very rapidly changing as well.
Change is vitally important. Anyone who has to deal with neuro issues, the sense that things are changing is vital to the further change. It's kind of exponential thing. I can't explain it properly scientifically, but I have one or two other issues, and I'm okay with them so long as I feel there is change going in one direction or another. It's when you feel locked in that depression arrives, and you lose all sense of value in life. And music, music is brilliant because it's all about change in time. It changes the experience of time, listening to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think another thing that just listening to you discuss your experiences, I think that's really important to point out, or to even to chat about, is that we often think of hearing loss or deafness as an all or nothing scenario. Okay, I'm creating a cliche because I know not many people think that, but if you're deaf, how can you hear music? Because some music is something that people who have hearing loss can't experience. But I think your example shows us that everybody's experience of hearing loss is unique and quite different, and also it's not an all or nothing scenario. Not only is there change all the time, but everybody has a unique experience of hearing loss, and it's multidimensional as well.
Yes, and I think as much as everyone has a unique experience of hearing, a unique experience of music. That's one of the wonders of music, because it reminds us all the time, with every passing beat, every passing bar, that we are individuals and we're experiencing the world in a completely different way to the person who's sitting right next to you even. And that is extraordinary. That is the remarkable thing about humans. And it seems to me a really good explanation of why music, again, going back to what you were saying 3 minutes ago, is central in our culture as well as in our individual lives.
Yeah, because the meaning that we give to music, it isn't determined by the chords or the tonality or the key signature of the piece of music. The music has this ambiguity, so that when we listen to music, we give it a unique meaning based upon our experience and our own history, our own family, our own education. And then hearing loss as well suddenly becomes, not suddenly, but can gradually become a way of giving meaning to music. And so
this book that I'm pointing to, rather self-obsessedly, Voices, is an attempt. That's the paperback edition. Is an attempt to grapple with precisely that. That music exists only when we meet it halfway. Music doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's meaningless in a vacuum. It's the old tree in a forest. If nobody's there to see it fall, does it actually fall? Music doesn't really exist without ears there to listen to it. And what we bring to the experience of listening to music is what gives it meaning. Its meaning does not reside, I believe, intrinsically in music.
Yeah.
And I think the journey that we're talking about, this process of life whereby we engage and ascribe value to music, is actually a kind of model, a metaphor for what life is anyway.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point, and I think it is a lot of traditional musicology resides in trying to ascribe meaning to particular notes, to particular scales, particular keys, and a lot of, and once again, I'm creating a bit of a straw man here, but, Beethoven was great, Mozart was great because they understood how to communicate meaning. They understood the relationship between chords and tones and melodies. But what we're suggesting here is that actually the meaning resides within ourselves. There is no correct meaning. There is no one meaning that any particular piece of music has, that we all give music its own meaning through our own ears, our head, our brain, our life is what gives music meaning.
You've reminded me of that great scene in This Is Spinal Tap, where Nigel Tufnell leans on the piano keyboard and plays a D minor chord, and he says, "You know what I think? I think D minor is the saddest of all keys." And you look at him and you think how absurd that is. And you're in that moment, you're realizing that unconsciously that what you just said is 100% true.
Yeah,
it's what you bring to it that gives it meaning. There's nothing intrinsic in music.
Yeah, no, and that's also what gives it its power as well. That it is flexible and pliable, and so it becomes seared into our consciousness. It becomes such an important part, and it mattered to us as well. I think that's the other beautiful example you were giving it. Your depression and your anger and your sadness was a result of realizing that perhaps you thought there in the book that there was a loss in terms of, I cannot have this relationship with my relationship with music is fundamentally changed. But I think what you were saying, there was a loss, but then there was a re-establishment, almost a negotiation and a rebirth in terms of your relationship with music.
And my relationship with life. And I'm going to say something that's going to sound incredibly sappy. And I apologize to all listeners who hear this. It may grate and it may sound revolting, but I do not view my hearing loss as an absolute loss, but actually as a kind of inflection point that changed my life in such a way as to introduce new possibilities that have actually made my life better. I mean, and I literally mean that. My life has been improved, not because my hearing is screwed, but because it resulted in certain events taking place, like writing books, it renewed my relationship with music when I was finally able to hear it after 3 years. And I was very, very lucky. I realized that I was able to get that much back. It renewed my contract with music for what its real worth was. That actually made my involvement with music much deeper and richer and more enjoyable. And as a result, life is better and more enjoyable, which is a bizarre thing to say when I've got roaring tinnitus in one ear and no hearing, and I'm a bit physically cropped, but it's true. It's literally true, and I'm not saying that for effect.
I don't think that sounds sappy at all, and I think it's a very, very important point to make, because too often, and I think society reinforces this notion of disability or impairment as something that diminishes people. But what we're saying is that the disability resides very often in society's construction of what hearing loss is. That if you have hearing loss, then there's something wrong. There's something something not functioning, something that's malfunctioning. But and that becomes instilled in the language that we use about hearing loss, the language that we use about disability, and our expectations. And I say not just of hearing loss, but of all disabilities. So I think hearing your story it's really important to reinforce that the complexities and the nuances and the subtleties around what happens when people experience hearing loss, and the way in which, in particular, I think music is a great example of looking at the way in which everybody's experience of hearing loss is unique, and this journey it can be quite different for everybody.
I absolutely agree with every morsel of what you've just said, every syllable. I wish I could add something to it, but I can't. Too cogent.
I think, I mean, actually, maybe because there's a couple of, I must confess, I haven't read the whole of this particular book, but I do love the title, and I love the themes of each of the chapters. So once again here, the notion of voices, right. It's literally about the quality in people's voices and what you hear in people's voices, but there's also a metaphorical voice as well, in terms of, what is music and what does music mean? And I'm thinking, once again, in your own experience, the relationship between the voice and hearing loss as well. So would you say that these are some of the sort of general themes that are coming out of this particular book?
Yes, I think you could certainly say that they're all in there. I should write a kind of an account of hearing voices as a kind of memoir, because it dawned on me long ago that the voices that meant most to me weren't necessarily the best or most beautiful or most technically accomplished voices, and that there was something meaningful about that. Why is it that I like Al Green, but I don't particularly like Otis Redding. Now, Otis Redding is, I wouldn't argue for a moment that he isn't a great soul singer. But why is it that I prefer listening to Al Green and I get more from Al Green? The book started as an exploration of that, but I wanted to make it chronological so that it followed the pattern of a life, and it starts with the voices that I received as historical voices. In other words, the four great rock and rollers, Elvis, Chuck Berry, Little Richard, and Jerry Lee Lewis, whom I was born in 1960, which meant by the time I was listening to those guys as golden oldies on the radio, it was 10 years later. Yeah. And they might as well have been the voices of the ancient prophets, even though they were being recorded around the time I was being born. So they arrived with a kind of freight of peculiar meaning that I wanted to disentangle in the book, and carry forward through all the other voices that I heard along the way. Experiencing those voices as part of the story of a life, because this is precisely what we've been talking about in the past half hour, that when we think about music, we're thinking about life. I got as far as the age of 21 and the voices that I was listening to then, and I realized that it was a kind of another inflection point, and I stopped listening to music in the way that I'd always listened to it before, but it formed quite a neat history of post-war rock and roll pop music from 1960 to 1981, and I stopped there because it was convenient and it made a certain kind of sense. But it explores the relationship we have. We all, as individuals, evolve with voices. I've never understood why Frank Sinatra has not connected with me. I can hear. He's an absolutely great singer. Many of my Scottish friends, for instance, they're very, very attached to Frank Sinatra and absolutely look daggers at me. They think, what a tosspot, what an English twat. He doesn't get Frank Sinatra. Well, I kind of do get Frank Sinatra. I can hear he's great. Yeah. I just don't like his voice. Mm-hmm. It doesn't speak to me. Why is that? And that's what this book is about.
Yeah. No, that's a great example. My father was a huge Frank Sinatra fan as well, so I grew up not only listening to Frank Sinatra, but listening to my father singing Frank Sinatra.
And do you like Frank Sinatra?
I do like Frank Sinatra too. Not, but also I think it also reinforces some of the points we made earlier. I love Frank Sinatra because I think of my father when I think of Frank Sinatra. I think of, and my mother's family are Italian, so there's the Italian connection. I think of my father singing "Lady's a Tramp." I can now see my father singing at his 70th birthday. You know, he once went to a wedding, and I was in the band because I was playing saxophone in the band, and my dad was a guest at the wedding. And my dad really wanted to sing with the band, and I could see the boss going, "Oh my God, here's a drunk Scotsman asking to sing with him." So I could see him say, "No, you can't sing with the band." But when he was 70, my sisters and my brother, we got together and we hired this band and surprised my dad. And we said, "Look, can we hire you for a gig? But you need to let my dad sing. He's got to sing 'Lady's a Tramp' with the band." So you know, as soon as you mention Frank Sinatra, these sort of memories are in my head. And so that relationship with, you know, not just his voice. I think he's a great, because I think one of his big albums was called The Voice, wasn't it? So it's not just Sinatra's voice, but also his relationship with my father and my mother, and the cultural sort of aura that's around Frank Sinatra. So that's. But I actually, and I can also. I'll just agree. If I think about his actual voice, you can say, yeah, actually, his voice maybe wasn't technically as interesting as accomplished as other people's voices. And also, when you see him in some of these clips with Dean Martin, he does look quite stiff, and he very often, you know, is the least relaxed person on you know, in these. There's the TV programs that I've sometimes seen of him. So there's you know, I hold him very close to my heart because of the role, the position that he has in with my family. Like some of the earliest jazz gigs I went to see in Glasgow, was a band in a little bar. And the reason my dad wanted to see this big band was because there was a person who sang like Frank Sinatra, you know, and he Tommy Reed was his name, and he had this, and he was a really, it wasn't just a Frank Sinatra, he was a great singer, but he sang the Sinatra songs really well, and my dad loved to hear these songs.
Fantastic. For what it's worth, the chapter that was hardest to write, and I think is probably the least successful in the book, is the one where I try to explain why I think Frank Sinatra doesn't work for me, even though I think he's great. And all those things you listed about cultural aura, and in particular, you didn't mention masculinity.
Yes,
are reasons why I've never been able to connect. Mm-hmm. But let's leave Frank there.
Yeah.
Moving swiftly on. I'm slightly embarrassed about it.
No, but there's another. I'm sort of. There was another question that I thought, because there's another metaphor that comes out of the train in the night. Quite early on in the book, you talk about listening to music as buildings, creating architectural buildings, and when the hearing loss came on, suddenly those buildings disappeared and everything was flat.
It's not a metaphor, Raymond. Right. It's literally the case.
Mm-hmm.
I used to, when I had two ears, I used to hear, because you need two ears for dimensionality in sound as well as directionality. Ghastly words, but there it is. I used to hear music as essentially architectural structures that you could inhabit.
Mm-hmm.
And it's easiest to explain in terms of an orchestra. You know, you can go and sit with the cellos, or you can sit with the violins, or you can put your fingers in your ears and sit with the trombones, and they're all different rooms in the building of music. And I used to experience it as that. And when I went down to one ear, it went completely flat, literally completely flat. And I write quite a lot about it in the book as an experience, and it was really disturbing and very upsetting. And I can remember that my first experiments trying to work out what had happened, and funnily enough, coming back to Miles Davis, I was playing Miles Davis because Miles Davis always allows lots of space. He plays with space as part of his musical language. And I remember sitting there in front of Miles Davis thinking, how can Miles Davis, with all this sense of space in the music as an intrinsic part of the music, be flat? And it was literally as if it was a squiggle on a piece of paper. Now, I think probably with hindsight, I don't feel like that now. I think with hindsight, probably it was my brain simply reacting in the only way it could to, as a way of making the music in some way expressible, was to flatten it out. Because I couldn't hear it. It was distorted. It was, as I said before, kind of often chaotic in my brain. And the way my brain was able best to allow me to understand it as a musical experience was to flatten it out. I still hear music fairly flatly. I don't have the full architecture anymore because I've only got one ear. But somehow my brain has relearned the language of hearing that allows me to hear dimensionality. So if I were to go and put Someday My Prince Will Come by Miles Davis on now and stand in front of it, I would get that sense of buildings and architraves and portals and recesses and everything that I get from music, even though it's only going in through one ear and there's no actual dimensionality involved.
Yeah. No, it's a fascinating example. There's a sort of trait theory of personality in psychology, and it's not one that I necessarily subscribe to, but I think it's interesting, case in point here, that some people are what we call empathizers and some people are systemizers, and systemizers see the structure and see the relationship between different elements, and when empathizers are less concerned with the structure, but they're more interested in the feeling. And so when I was reading that part of the book, I was thinking that this idea of hearing music as architecture is quite close to the sort of a systemizer's idea of how we might listen to music. But it made me also think, well, as your experience of music changed, did your experience of the emotion in the music change as well? So that's a great example of how, the sort of structural aspects of your listening and the way in which you recreate the song in your head almost. But in terms of feeling emotion, did that change as well as a result of this flattening out?
No. Once I could hear it.
Yeah.
So I could hear it better, so that I suppose, so that I could recall what the music had meant to me before and measure that against what the music was potentially meaning for me now. I still felt it, and it became more intense, in fact. I think I'm both an empathizer and a systemizer, actually.
Yeah.
Because I do love the singular impact, emotional impact of music, the way it hits me as a thing. But I also like to be able to look at it and see what it's made of. And I've always been that way.
You're speaking to an empathizer and a systemizer. I don't necessarily subscribe to this particular, actually, it's this approach. But I think intellectually, it's great for talking about, and it's great for. I use it in my teaching occasionally because I think it's a good vehicle for discussing different approaches to personality. But quite early on, with one of my colleagues, we got these different tests out, and I scored very highly on both. There
we go. I think I would as well.
Yeah.
But I think Raymond, I mean, something we haven't talked about is, or maybe we did sort of touch on it, is the degree to which people differ in the way that they allow themselves to value music. And the seriousness with which they take their own apprehension of music as an experience. And people like you and me clearly have no problem in taking music massively seriously, just on contact, because we think it's an all-encompassing, beautiful, overwhelming thing. I know many people, as I'm sure you do, who see music just as a sort of incidental thing like a piece of furniture in the room.
Yeah.
Oh, it's a chair and it's over there and it has nothing to do with me. I might sit on it if I choose to, but I might not. But it's not of great importance. I can't react to music like that. I have to take the highway with music, and go full on with it every time. Yeah.
No, I completely agree. The way I sometimes talk about this is about, that I feel it's important to be evangelical about the importance that music has and the role that music has and our universal capacity to engage with music and play music, but not to be fundamentalist about it. So you're sort of to be evangelical in terms of, and I like to think of it as an evidence-based evangelism, to say, actually, this isn't just sort of mealy-mouthed utopian sort of wishful thinking. There actually is a significant and a growing body of evidence to support these particular assertions. But as you're saying, for some people, it might not be important. So, and that is also important to recognise as well. So when I say we are all musical, I'm not saying we all have to be playing the guitar or we all have to be singing. But there are so many people that I meet that say, oh, I wish I could sing, or I'm too old, or I don't have. And say, well, actually, the evidence suggests if you want to do it, then go and do it. And I think also what's fascinating here is that the lockdown that we've experienced and what's happened over the past year, a lot of people have re-established and renegotiated their relationship with music, whether that's... Sorry.
No, I'm leaning forward because I really want to hear what you're going to say.
So, whether it's Italians singing Bella Ciao from their balcony as they were all locked down in Sicily in order to use music as a way to connect with people, or online choirs where people, that we're in our houses, we literally can't go out our doors, but we can use music as a way of maintaining and sustaining our community, of being connected, and in some respects even enhancing our community. So my mother, who she loves music, but she's never been in a choir, she's never sang, but during lockdown she started getting singing lessons online, and so once a week. But those singing lessons aren't just about my mum singing Italian songs that she wants to sing. It's about having a laugh, having a joke, sharing experience with somebody. The music and the music lesson isn't just about the music. It's about finding a way and to be connected when we're all been locked in our houses.
Yes, I absolutely agree, and it brings us full circle back to our original point of agreement, which is that music isn't just a metaphor for life; it is life.
Yeah, yeah, and it defines our humanity as well, to some extent as well. That to be musical, to express ourselves musically, and to define ourselves through our musical taste is part of what it means to be human.
Absolutely, and losing access to it isn't necessarily the end of the road either.
Yeah, yes, because I think as your example, it's the access changes, and I think that's a really important message that I take from what you're saying, is that hearing loss is unique to every individual. Every individual experiences hearing loss in a different way, and music is. Neither is music an ultimate panacea. I think that's important to say. It's not just a case of, oh, let's take some music and this will make things better. It's about the sophisticated and complex way in which we use music in our life in order to enhance our life, to enrich our life, and to sort of renegotiate the journey of life as well as change happens.
I think that's absolutely spot on. I think it's a brilliant place to draw an ending, don't you?
I do. Look, I've had a fantastic time chatting to you, Nick, and I hope it's been just great to hear your stories and talk.
No, it's been absolutely brilliant, Raymond. It's 100% pleasure and nothing else. Thank you so much.